I had suspected for a while, but nothing hit harder than the moment I found real proof. It was a Thursday evening, and Jessica was in the shower, her phone carelessly left on the kitchen counter. I usually tried to respect her privacy, but something about the way she had been acting lately, distant, secretive, made it impossible to resist this time. I picked it up, opened it, and there it was, a text from a guy named Eric. "Can't wait for tomorrow night. I'll bring the wine. Tomorrow night." That was supposed to be her girls' night. I scrolled further, reading their messages. It was obvious. They were planning a night together at our place, while I'd be conveniently out with my buddies. They had done this before. I could tell from the way they talked so casually, as if I did not exist. My blood boiled. But instead of confronting her right away, I let the rage settle into something colder. I wasn't going to flip out and give her a chance to explain her way out of this. No, I wanted to hit her where it hurt, make her regret ever trying to play me for a fool. That night, lying in bed, I formed my plan. I was going to ruin their little rendezvous in a way she would never forget. The next morning, I got up before her and made a quick trip to the pet store. I knew exactly what I was looking for: tablets meant to induce vomiting in dogs. Safe but guaranteed to trigger an immediate, uncontrollable reaction. I had done my research. When I got home, I found the bottle of wine she had stashed in the cupboard. I knew it was for Eric. Jessica had been so obvious, excited even, talking about a new bottle she had picked out. I carefully drew some water into a syringe, then crushed the tablets into a fine powder and dissolved them. I opened the wine cabinet and there it was, the expensive bottle with the cork still intact. Smiling to myself, I pushed the syringe into the cork, slowly injecting the liquid back into the wine. She wouldn't notice a thing. The wine would taste just fine, right up until it hit their stomachs. I replaced the bottle exactly where she had left it, wiped the syringe clean, and left no trace of what I had done. I was calm, collected. Jessica thought she could humiliate me, bring her lover into my home? Not this time. The next day was quiet, too quiet. Jessica moved through the house like everything was normal, like she hadn't just planned to cheat on me under our own roof. She made breakfast, kissed me goodbye, and left for work, completely oblivious to the trap I had set for her and Eric. I spent most of the day going through the motions, trying to keep my mind off what was coming. Part of me still burned with anger, but another part, deep down, felt strangely calm. I knew what was about to happen. I had set everything in motion, and now I just had to wait for the inevitable. It felt like a sick game, and I was the only one who knew the rules. By evening, I was back home before Jessica, pretending like I hadn't spent the entire day plotting her humiliation. I glanced at the clock. She would be home any minute, and I knew she'd start prepping for her night out. Only this time, the night wasn't going to end the way she thought. Sure enough, Jessica walked through the door not long after. She was all smiles, even made some light conversation about her day. But I could see it in her eyes. She was distracted, already thinking about Eric. After a quick shower, she started getting ready, taking extra care with her hair and makeup, more than she ever did for me. The sight of her getting dolled up for another man made my stomach twist, but I kept my cool. While she was busy upstairs, I snuck a glance at the kitchen counter. There it was, the wine bottle. She had already taken it out and left it ready for their romantic night. I almost laughed at the thought of what was going to happen once they popped that cork, but the time wasn't right yet. I needed to play my role. "Have fun with the girls," I said casually as she finished getting ready. "Thanks, babe," she replied, giving me a quick peck on the cheek before heading out the door. The moment she left, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I kept a safe distance, driving slowly behind her, my heart pounding with every turn. I knew exactly where she was going. They weren't meeting somewhere public. They were coming back here. She was bringing him to our home. After about 20 minutes, she parked at some random bar, just long enough to meet Eric, and then they were back on the road. My blood boiled as I followed them all the way back to the house. I pulled up down the street, just out of sight, and waited. They both walked inside like nothing was wrong, laughing and talking as if they had the whole world to themselves. I watched them disappear through the front door, and then it was time to watch my plan unfold. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone. Days before, I had set up a small camera hidden in the living room, just enough to give me a front row seat to their little date. My pulse quickened as I watched Jessica and Eric settle on the couch, talking and laughing. The wine bottle sat on the table between them, still unopened. I waited, tense, knowing the moment was coming. Jessica reached for the wine opener, smiling at Eric, who leaned in closer to her, clearly ready for a romantic evening. Little did he know. I watched through the camera feed as Jessica fumbled with the corkscrew, laughing with Eric like they were in some cheesy romantic movie. My hand clenched the phone tighter, but I kept telling myself to stay calm. The real show was about to begin. Finally, Jessica popped the cork, pouring the wine into 2 glasses with a grin. Eric raised his glass, completely unaware of the ticking time bomb I had injected into that bottle. They clinked glasses, toasted to their perfect night, and took their first sips. I sat back in my car, adrenaline flooding through me as I watched them. I could already imagine what would happen next. The tablets I had dissolved weren't fast-acting, but when they hit, they would hit hard. The moment that wine settled in their stomachs, it would be game over. On the camera, Jessica leaned into Eric, her laughter carefree, as if she had no idea that her night was about to spiral into chaos. They sipped their wine casually, and the minutes ticked by. I felt a sick satisfaction knowing what was coming. Every smile, every soft touch between them just fueled my anger, but I stayed patient. They thought they had all the time in the world. Another 10 minutes passed, and I noticed a subtle change. Jessica's face tightened slightly, just for a moment, as if she felt a strange sensation in her stomach. She glanced at her wine glass, but Eric didn't notice. He was too busy running his fingers through her hair, too distracted by the idea of what he thought was coming next. Then it started. Jessica shifted in her seat, more obviously this time. She put her glass down and gave Eric a forced smile, but I could see the discomfort spreading across her face. She was trying to hold it together, but I knew that feeling. The same nausea that comes when your body suddenly realizes something is very wrong. Eric was clueless, sipping his wine and leaning in to kiss her. She turned her head slightly, trying to keep up appearances, but I saw it. Panic. It flickered in her eyes as her stomach started to rebel. She excused herself, trying to act casual, and hurried to the bathroom. I switched to the feed from the hidden camera in the hallway. Jessica bolted into the bathroom, her face twisted in discomfort. She slammed the door behind her, and from what I could tell, things were already going south. Fast. The camera didn't have sound, but I didn't need to hear it to know what was happening in there. Back in the living room, Eric sat clueless, staring at the bathroom door, probably wondering what was going on. I couldn't help but grin. I imagined Jessica hunched over the toilet, fighting back the waves of nausea and vomiting. The reality of her perfect night crashing down all around her. Minutes passed, and still, she didn't come out. Eric started fidgeting, checking his phone. He poured himself another glass of wine, taking another big gulp, sealing his fate without even knowing it. I almost laughed out loud watching him, sitting there like an idiot, waiting for a night that was never going to happen. Another 5 minutes went by, and then finally, the bathroom door cracked open. Jessica stepped out, pale and shaky. Her hair was a mess, and she looked like she had been through a war. She tried to play it off, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew something was wrong, really wrong. But instead of admitting it, she forced a weak smile and sat back down next to Eric, clearly hoping it would pass. But it wasn't going to pass. Not tonight. Jessica tried to settle back down on the couch, but it was obvious she wasn't fooling anyone, least of all Eric. Her face had gone pale, and she kept shifting, glancing nervously toward the bathroom. But Eric, either too clueless or too focused on what he thought was coming, leaned in closer, his ha. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low, trying to sound caring. But I could see it, the hint of empathy. "Yeah, I think so," Jessica muttered, but her voice was weak. She forced a smile, picking up her wine glass again. She probably thought another sip would help calm her nerves, smooth things over. Big mistake. The second the wine touched her lips, she set the glass down, hand trembling. This time, there was no hiding it. Jessica's face contorted, and she suddenly lurched forward, clutching her stomach. She tried to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. Eric straightened up, confusion written all over his face. "Jess?" His tone was sharper now, concern mixed with frustration. He didn't understand what was happening yet. "Are you all right?" But she didn't answer him. She shot up from the couch, bolting toward the bathroom like her life depended on it. The door slammed shut, and I switched to the hallway feed, watching her stumble, barely making it in time before the sound of retching filled the air. I couldn't see the mess through the camera, but I didn't need to. It was working perfectly. Meanwhile, back in the living room, Eric sat on the couch, staring at the bathroom door in utter confusion. He checked his phone, probably debating whether to give her a few minutes or just cut his losses. I almost laughed out loud. But then, his fate kicked in. I watched him reach for his glass and down what remained of the wine, the liquid that I had injected earlier with those special tablets. He wiped his mouth, sighing as if trying to figure out what had just gone wrong with his night. Then, slowly, a new expression crossed his face. Eric froze. His hand went to his stomach, the same way Jessica had done earlier, and I could see the realization dawning on him. He stood up, staggering slightly, his face twisting in discomfort. I leaned in closer to the screen, watching with satisfaction as Eric started to break. He gripped the back of the couch for support, breathing heavily, his entire body fighting the wave of nausea that was building inside him. His skin turned pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The cocky look he had worn earlier? Completely gone. Now he was just trying to hold himself together. But there was no stopping it. He doubled over, clutching his stomach, his face contorting as the cramps intensified. I knew exactly what was coming next. Eric stumbled toward the hallway, heading in the direction of the bathroom. Jessica's retching was still audible through the closed door. He pounded on it. "Jess, He could barely get the words out before he doubled over again. The night they had planned, their little secret romantic rendezvous, was over, and I was loving every second of it. Eric was in trouble now. The panic on his face was priceless as he stood outside the bathroom, pounding on the door with growing desperation. "Jess, come on, open up," he shouted, his voice strained. He couldn't hide the fear anymore. Whatever control he thought he had was gone, washed away by the nausea that was building in his gut. Inside the bathroom, Jessica was too far gone to respond. I could see her through the camera feed, hunched over the toilet, her body shaking as another wave of sickness hit her. She wasn't coming out anytime soon. Eric stumbled backward, clutching his stomach as he realized he wasn't going to make it. He scanned the room, looking for anywhere, any place, where he could find relief. But there was nowhere to go. He was trapped, and it was clear that his body had reached its breaking point. I watched with twisted satisfaction as Eric staggered back into the living room, his face a pale, sweaty mask of horror. He tried to hold it together, but I knew there was no chance. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the floor, retching violently, his whole body shaking as the wine and whatever dinner he'd had earlier came up in a mess on the carpet. I leaned back in my seat, a dark smile creeping across my face. This was better than anything I could have imagined. Eric, the guy who thought he could waltz into my home, drink my wife's wine, and steal her away from me, was now on his knees, vomiting like a sick dog in the middle of my living room. He wiped his mouth, gasping for air, his face contorted in agony. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled under him. I watched as he crawled toward the couch, collapsing against it, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The fight was gone from him. Now, it was just survival. In the bathroom, Jessica wasn't faring any better. She had stopped vomiting for the moment, but her pale, sweat-drenched face told me everything I needed to know. She was weak, defeated, probably wondering what the hell had gone wrong. She couldn't possibly know that it was me behind all of this, that the wine they had shared so innocently had been poisoned, not fatally, but just enough to tear their night to shreds. Eric, still sprawled on the floor, groaned in pain, trying to get his bearings. He glanced around, clearly trying to figure out what to do next. He needed help, but there was no one coming for him. Jessica was locked away, and I was nowhere near ready to let this disaster come to an end. I watched as he reached for his phone, his shaking fingers barely able to unlock it. His face twisted in frustration as he struggled to dial, trying to call for help, but his body betrayed him again. His stomach heaved, and he collapsed back onto the floor, clutching his sides as another wave of nausea hit him hard. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. The camera feed flickered as the scene played out in front of me. Jessica trapped in the bathroom, Eric writhing on the floor. Everything was falling apart for them, just like I wanted. The revenge wasn't just sweet. It was perfect. Eric lay there, completely wrecked, his phone forgotten on the floor as his body betrayed him again. He curled up, his arms wrapped around his stomach as if that could stop the waves of nausea that kept coming. Sweat dripped down his face, his breathing ragged, and it was clear he was in no shape to move. The pathetic sight of him, broken and helpless, made me feel something I hadn't expected: satisfaction. This was the man Jessica had been risking everything for? This guy who was now vomiting on my living room floor? I almost laughed at the thought. In the bathroom, Jessica hadn't moved. She was still huddled over the toilet, occasionally gagging, her face a pale, sweaty mask of misery. If she had any ideas of sneaking off with Eric, they were long gone. Right now, all she could focus on was keeping herself from falling apart. I let the scene play out for a few more minutes, watching them suffer. The wine had done its job perfectly. Jessica and Eric were in no condition to continue whatever disgusting little affair they thought they had. My plan had been a success, but I wasn't done yet. There was still one more thing I needed to do before I could let them off the hook. I wasn't just going to sit back and watch. I wanted to confront them, make sure they knew I had been pulling the strings all along. I started my car and drove back toward the house, my heart pounding harder with every mile. Part of me was nervous, not knowing how this confrontation would go. But the other part, the part that was still fueled by rage and betrayal, was ready. I wanted to see the look on their faces when they realized I had caught them. I wanted them to know they weren't the ones in control. I parked a few houses down, out of sight, and walked the rest of the way. As I approached the front door, I could still hear Eric groaning from inside. It was a pitiful sound. The door was unlocked. Jessica hadn't bothered to lock it, too wrapped up in her excitement to think about anything else when they came in. I stepped inside quietly, taking in the scene before me. Eric was sprawled out on the floor, his face buried in the carpet, while Jessica was still locked away in the bathroom, unaware that I had arrived. I shut the door behind me, making sure they heard it. Eric stirred, lifting his head slightly, his eyes bleary and confused as he squinted in my direction. His face paled even more when he realized who was standing there. Mike, he stammered, his voice weak and shaky. He tried to push himself up, but his body gave out, leaving him slumped against the couch. I didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching him struggle. The satisfaction of seeing him like this, completely ruined, was more than I could have imagined. I had waited for this moment, and now I was going to enjoy every second of it. You look like shit, Eric, I said, my voice cold and sharp. He opened his mouth to respond, but instead, his body convulsed, and he doubled over again. Retching onto the carpet, I stepped back, letting the moment sink in, knowing that whatever power he thought he had was gone. You know, I said, pacing around the room, I was thinking about how to handle this. I could have gone the usual route, confront her, throw a fit, file for divorce. But then I thought, why not do something special? Why not give you two a night you'll never forget? Eric was trying to pull himself together, but it was clear he wasn't going anywhere. He slumped back against the couch, his chest heaving as he fought to control the nausea still racking his body. His face was pale, beads of sweat clinging to his forehead, and his eyes darted toward the bathroom door where Jessica was still trapped. I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms, watching him squirm. You thought you could come into my home, drink my wine, and sleep with my wife? I asked, the coldness in my voice unmistakable. You really thought you'd get away with it? Eric didn't respond. He was too busy clutching his stomach, his body still betraying him with every movement. I could tell he was trying to figure out how this had happened, how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. But I wasn't going to let him think for too long. I stepped forward, my shoes inches from his face as he groaned and rolled to the side, his breaths shallow. Surprised? I asked, the hint of a smirk playing on my lips. I bet you didn't expect that special touch in the wine, huh? You see, I thought if you were going to betray me in my own house, the least I could do was make sure you'd never forget it. His eyes widened as he finally started to understand. He tried to speak, but his body doubled over again, his words replaced by a gagging noise as he retched helplessly onto the floor. I stepped back, shaking my head at the sight of him. This was the guy Jessica had chosen? Pathetic. From the bathroom, I could hear Jessica moving around, her breathing labored as she tried to collect herself. She had no idea I was there yet. No clue that the mess she was in had been orchestrated by me from the start. I walked over to the bathroom door and knocked lightly, just once, to make sure she knew I was out there. The sound of my knock seemed to freeze her in place, and I heard a faint gasp from the other side. She must have recognized the sound of my knock, even through her haze of sickness. "Jess," I called through the door, my voice calm, but laced with the kind of anger I had been holding in for weeks. "You in there, babe?" There was a pause, and then a weak reply. Mike." Her voice was shaky, fragile. I could hear the panic rising in her tone. What are you doing here?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. What was I doing here? She really thought she could sneak Eric into our home, drink with him, sleep with him, and I wouldn't find out? Did she think I was that stupid? "I should be asking you the same thing," I said, my tone sharp now. "What am I doing here?" "I'm at my house, Jess. The real question is, why the hell are you and Eric here?" There was no response at first, just the sound of her struggling to stand. I could picture her, pale and weak, trying to figure out how to get out of this, how to explain away the mess she had created. But there was no way out. Not this time. "Mike, please." She stammered through the door, her voice cracking. I can explain." "Oh, I bet you can," I snapped, stepping away from the door. "But you know what? I'm not interested in your excuses. I've heard enough lies for a lifetime." I walked back to where Eric was still sprawled on the floor, his face twisted in pain. He glanced up at me, his eyes filled with fear. He knew what was coming. "You two made your choices," I continued, pacing around the room. "You thought you could do this behind my back and get away with it. But guess what? I've been watching you this whole time. Every message, every call, every plan you made for tonight. I knew all of it." Jessica let out a sob from behind the bathroom door. "Mike, I'm sorry. I swear it wasn't what you think." Her voice cracked with desperation. I shook my head, the weight of her words no longer affecting me. "Oh, Jess, it's exactly what I think. And now, you both get to live with the consequences." The bathroom door opened a crack, and Jessica stumbled out, clinging to the wall for support. Her face was pale, her hair a mess, and she looked like she had just gone through hell. She barely glanced at Eric, who was still slumped on the floor, trying to keep from vomiting again. "Mike, please," she whimpered, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." I stared at her, feeling nothing but disgust. She was trying to put on that familiar face, the one she used to use when we had small arguments, thinking she could charm her way out of this. But this time, it wasn't going to work. "Not what it looks like," I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. "So, what? I'm imagining everything? You didn't bring Eric into our house, pour him wine, and plan to sleep with him while I was supposed to be out." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She knew she was caught. She tried to wipe her face, but the tears mixed with sweat just made her look even more pathetic. Eric groaned from the floor, still clutching his stomach, and Jessica looked down at him, her panic rising again. "Eric," she whimpered, "are you okay?" He barely moved, his face still twisted in pain. He couldn't even answer her, and frankly, I didn't care. The two of them deserved every bit of this. "You know what's funny?" I said, pacing the living room, my voice cold. "I thought about confronting you weeks ago. I could have stopped this then, but I waited. I wanted to see how far you'd go. And now, I get to watch it all fall apart." Jessica's eyes filled with fresh tears. She stumbled toward me, reaching out with shaking hands. "Mike, I'm so sorry. Please, let's just talk about this." I stepped back, avoiding her touch. Don't touch me. Don't try to explain. I don't want to hear it." Her tears flowed harder now, her voice cracking. I made a mistake. I know I screwed up, but I love you. I never meant to hurt you, I swear. I shook my head, my anger rising again. Love me? You're really going to stand here, after everything, and say you love me? She was sobbing now, her words barely coherent through the tears. I do. I don't know why I did this. I've been confused, my guy. Confused? I cut her off, my voice sharp. You weren't confused when you invited him into our house. You weren't confused when you started lying to me, sneaking around. Don't stand there and act like this was some accident. Jessica collapsed onto the couch, her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I had seen her cry before, but this time, it meant nothing. Her tears couldn't wash away the betrayal. I glanced at Eric, who was still barely conscious on the floor, groaning softly as his body fought the effects of the wine. He was trying to sit up now, his movements slow and painful. I knelt down next to him, making sure he could see me clearly through his dazed expression. You, I said, my voice low. You thought you could just waltz in here and take what's mine? How does it feel now, Eric? How does it feel knowing you've lost everything in one night? He opened his mouth, but all that came out was a dry heave. He clutched his stomach again, his face twisting in agony. I stood up, looking down at him like the pathetic mess he was. You're lucky I didn't do worse, I said, walking toward the door. Both of you are. I grabbed my coat, turning my back on the disaster I had created. Jessica was still crying, her body shaking with sobs, and Eric was barely clinging to consciousness. I had seen enough. You have until the end of the week to pack your things and leave, I said coldly. If you're still here, I'll throw your stuff out myself. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out, leaving the door open behind me, the sound of Jessica's sobs following me into the night. I stepped out into the cold night, the chill biting through my jacket as I walked away from the house, away from them. My mind was a blur of thoughts and emotions, but the overwhelming feeling was one of relief. It was finally over. I had seen everything I needed to see, and I had made sure they both felt the full weight of their choices. I got in my car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I sat in silence. The sound of Jessica's sobs and Eric's groans still echoed in my head, but I pushed it aside. They deserved every bit of what happened. There was no going back now, no fixing what they had broken. I drove aimlessly for a while, not really caring where I ended up. I just needed space, some time to breathe and process what had happened. Part of me still felt the rage simmering beneath the surface, but another part of me, an unexpected part, felt lighter. As twisted as it was, seeing them both fall apart had brought me a sense of closure. They had lied, cheated, and betrayed me, but now the tables had turned. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a small bar on the edge of town. It was one of those places where no one asked questions, where people want to forget for a few hours. I walked in, found a seat at the bar, and ordered a drink. The place was half empty, quiet, with only the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses in the background. Exactly what I needed. As I took the first sip of my whiskey, I replayed the events of the night in my mind. The looks on their faces, the panic, the desperation. It was all so clear. I had imagined confronting Jessica 1,000 times, but I had never expected it to play out like this. Watching her crumble, watching Eric suffer. It should have felt satisfying, and it did, to a point. But there was something else creeping in now, something I hadn't anticipated. I felt empty. I stared down into my glass, swirling the amber liquid slowly. Sure, I had gotten my revenge. I had made them pay. But now what? The house was still mine, but it was full of memories that had been tainted beyond repair. Jessica was broken. Eric was humiliated, but their pain didn't erase what had happened. The betrayal was still there, lingering, eating away at me. A voice broke through my thoughts. You all right, man? I looked up to see the bartender standing in front of me, polishing a glass. His eyes were tired but friendly, the kind of guy who'd seen it all. I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Yeah, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to myself. Just had one hell of a night. He chuckled, setting the glass down. We all have those sometimes. Want to talk about it? I shook my head, taking another sip of my drink. Not really. He nodded, understanding. He didn't push, and I was grateful for that. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to think. I just wanted to sit there and let the numbness settle in. Let the whiskey dull the edges of everything. But as the minutes ticked by, something started gnawing at me. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was the realization that no matter what I did, no matter how much they suffered, I couldn't change the past. The damage was done, and even though I had taken control of the situation, it didn't change the fact that the woman I loved had betrayed me in the worst possible way. The thought of going back to that house, seeing Jessica's things, knowing what had happened there, it made my skin crawl. I couldn't stay there. Not now, not after everything. I paid my tab and left the bar, the cold night air slapping me in the face as I stepped outside. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going home. The drive back felt longer than it should have. I wasn't in a rush to return. The satisfaction I'd felt earlier, watching Jessica and Eric suffer, had worn off, leaving behind a dull emptiness. I knew when I walked through that door, everything would be different. And I was right. When I pulled up to the house, the lights were still on, casting an eerie glow through the windows. I could see shadows moving inside, but there was no sound. I pushed open the door, the cold air following me inside. The living room looked exactly as I'd left it, except for Jessica, who now sat slumped on the couch, her face buried in her hands. The sight of her used to stir something in me. Love. Comfort. Now, just a hollow reminder of what we'd lost. She must have heard me come in because she looked up, her eyes bloodshot, tears streaking down her cheeks. She looked wrecked, completely broken. "Mike," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I stood there, just inside the doorway, staring at her. It was strange seeing her like this, so vulnerable, so defeated. But all I could feel was cold detachment. The woman sitting on that couch wasn't the same woman I had married. She had made her choices, and now we were both living with the consequences. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she sobbed, getting up, stumbling toward me. "I wasn't thinking. I still love you." Love. That word felt so cheap coming from her now. I shook my head slowly, the weight of everything settling in. "If you loved me, Jess, you wouldn't have done any of this." Her tears flowed harder. I know I made a mistake. Please, Mike, we can fix this. We can try." But I wasn't moved by her tears anymore. Maybe a part of me had wanted to hear those words earlier. Maybe a part of me had wanted her to beg for another chance. But standing there, listening to her, I realized something important. It didn't matter. There was no going back. We were too far gone. "You need to leave," I said, my voice steady but firm. "It's over." She looked at me, wide-eyed, as if she hadn't fully grasped the finality of what I was saying. "Mike, please, we can talk about this, I cut her off, my patience wearing thin. "There's nothing to talk about. Pack your things and go. You made your choice, Jess." For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me like she didn't believe what she was hearing. Then, her shoulders slumped, the fight drained out of her. She nodded slowly, wiping her tears with shaky hands, and without another word, she turned and walked upstairs. I listened to the sounds of her moving around, the quiet rustling of clothes being thrown into a suitcase. My body felt heavy, but not with anger anymore. It was something else, something deeper. Loss, maybe. Grief for what we'd had and what had been shattered. When she came back down, she didn't look at me. She walked past me without a word, heading for the door. Just as her hand touched the doorknob, she hesitated, turning back to face me one last time. "Mike, I really did love you," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. We both knew the truth. Whatever love we had was gone, buried under lies and betrayal. The door closed behind her, and just like that, she was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, staring at the spot where she had been moments before, feeling the weight of everything settle on my shoulders. The revenge I'd planned had been sweet in the moment, but now that it was over, the emptiness was all that remained. I sat down on the couch, the same couch where Jessica and Eric had been, and let out a long, shaky breath. The house felt cold, lifeless. Everything was different now, and I was alone. There was no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just the quiet realization that I'd lost something I could never get back. As I stared at the empty room, I realized that this wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of who we had been. Jessica had made her choice, and so had I. There was no turning back. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the back of the couch, letting the silence envelop me. Tomorrow, I would figure out what came next. But for now, all I could do was sit with the cold truth that the life I had known was over. And somehow, I was okay with that.